January of 1966. I want the rest of you to be courteous and pay attention to what he says. What happened in January of 1966?
The B-52 bomber collided with the 45 plane, and 6 members were dead. And a hydrogen bomb fell from the plane into the coast off Spain.
Is that true?
Question. Will the test just be on this?
No.
Let me start over. Levi, tell me what happened on June 17th of 1966. I said January, I said June. I do that all the time. What happened on June 17th of 1966? Quiet, please.
2 men and a woman were fatally shot in the Lafayette Bar in Jersey, in Patterson, New Jersey.
Okay, as he said, 2 men and a woman were fatally shot at the Lafayette Bar and Grill in Patterson, New Jersey. That leads us to the story of Rubin Hurricane Carter. Rather than try to explain this to you, I just thought I'd give you a little bit of a break here, and we're going to go through this. Now, the quiz tomorrow will be on this lecture that you have in front of you, plus the handout I gave you that talks about Rubin Hurricane Carter Guide. Okay, and some of the material is repetitive, but pay attention. Okay, in late June 1966, not long after the 2 men and the woman were killed at the Lafayette Bar and Grill in Patterson, New Jersey, Rubin Hurricane Carter and another fellow by the name of John Artis were questioned by police concerning those 3 murders that were mentioned. Now, Carter at the time was a professional boxer. He was ranked #1 for the middleweight boxing crown, which means that he wasn't the world champion, but he was ranked first to get the shot at the title. He would be the first contender that would get to fight the champion for the title. Very good boxer. Because of his style of boxing, he had earned the nickname the Hurricane. Okay? Now, Artis, on the other hand, was simply a young black man who gave Carter a ride home early the morning of the murders. He really didn't have a lot to do with Rubin Hurricane Carter. He just happened to be at the bar with him. They were acquaintances, and he's the one that gave him a ride home early that morning of the murders. Well, on October 14th of 1966, a witness by the name of Alfred Bellow gave New Jersey police a signed statement claiming that he saw Rubin Carter and John Artis at the June 17th murder scene. He he signed a signed statement stating that. Well, on October 15th, the next day, Carter and Artis were arrested for the triple murder that took place in the New Jersey tavern. Well, on May 27th, 1967, an all-white jury convicted both Carter and Artis, and the 2 men were sentenced to prison for 3 lifetime terms each. Okay, 1 for each of the murder. Well, during the first 7 years that Carter spent in prison, he wrote a book called The 16th Round, which was published in September of 1974. Here's the book here. Very, very rare book. Okay? And this one is kind of interesting because it's signed by somebody. It says, "A man who has dedicated his life to the eradication of injustice and suffering. My hope is that this book will reinforce your efforts to help others who've had to face the fate of oppression." And signed, your son Chip. He must have bought this book for somebody that he thought was wrongfully convicted or accused. I don't know the history about it. But this is a very rare book worth hundreds of dollars. Okay, because you can't find it. Anyway, while he spent the first 7 years in prison, he wrote that book entitled The 16th Round. We'll come back to a story. That same September of 1974, in which the book was finished, that Alfred Bellow, that witness, stated that he was pressured by detectives to give false testimony toward both Carter and Artis. Bellow stated he was offered $10,000 in reward money and promised a lenient treatment in criminal charges that were pending against him in exchange for that written statement stating he saw Carter and Artis at the murder. Well, 8 years later, in May of 1975, Carter sent a copy of his book, The 16th Round, to singer Bob Dylan because of Bob Dylan's commitment to the civil rights struggle. This happens to be a picture up there of Bob Dylan and Hurricane Carter that's part of the song lyrics that's signed by Rubin Hurricane Carter there.
So that was only a year after he wrote the book?
Mhm. Yep. Now, in July of 1975, after receiving the book and reading it, Dylan wrote a song entitled The Hurricane. And he recorded the song on July 30th. He performed it for the first time on television on September 10th, 1975. And in November, The Hurricane is released and Dylan begins a benefit tour with all proceeds going to Carter's Defense Fund. Well, on March 17th, 1976, the New Jersey Supreme Court unanimously overturned Carter and Artis' conviction ruling that the prosecution withheld evidence favorable to the defense. So a new trial was ordered, and on December 22nd, 1976, the second trial commenced. Okay? Prosecuting lawyers argued that Carter committed the murders for racial revenge, as the bar where the murders were committed would not allow blacks to be served. Carter was then reconvicted. The same life sentences were imposed, and he went back to prison. Well, this is kind of an interesting story that resulted in a movie that starred Denzel Washington as Rubin Hurricane Carter entitled The Hurricane. If you get a chance to see it, it'd be well worth your while. Well, in 1979, a special relationship began between Carter and a young black teenager by the name of Lesra Martin. And Martin was just 15 years old. He was essentially illiterate. He was trying to survive a violent ghetto in Brooklyn, New York. He was taken from the ghetto with permission of his parents by three Canadian free spirit, basically they were hippies is what they were, honestly. They were hippies. They were in business, entrepreneurs, etc. But they basically were free-spirited hippies. And they offered to take Lesra and educate him. Well, to start things out, they took him to a book sale, and Lesra paid 25 cents for that book, The 16th Round, which was the first book he ever attempted to read in his life. He was consumed by the book, and he eventually wrote Rubin Carter a letter in prison. Carter, who was touched by the letter, responded back to Lesra, and a moving relationship began. The three Canadians then took on Carter's legal case, even moving to New Jersey to study his arrest, study the trials, and his conviction. And because of their efforts in digging up new information, Carter was given a third hearing in 1985. Now, when did he go to jail? Does anybody remember? Been in there a while, hasn't he? Well, on November 7th, 1985, Judge H. Lee Sorokin of federal court in Newark, New Jersey, overturned that second trial convictions. And he ruled after discovering that the prosecution committed, quote, grave constitutional violations, and that the convictions were based on racism rather than reason, and concealment rather than disclosure. Well, the state of New Jersey appealed all the way to the United States Supreme Court in an effort to have Rubin Carter and John Artis returned to prison. And on January 11th, 1988, the Supreme Court upheld Judge Sorokin's decision to set Rubin Carter and John Artis free, and both innocent men had spent 22 years in prison. 22 years. Well, the Canadians that helped free Carter returned back to their native Canada, and Rubin Carter joined them there, and he eventually moved to Toronto, Canada, where he worked as the executive director of the Association in Defense of the Wrongly Convicted. This is kind of touching. In 1993, the World Boxing Council awarded Rubin Hurricane Carter the World Middleweight Championship belt. This honor was in recognition of Rubin Hurricane Carter's 22-year fight for freedom, an honor that had never been bestowed any fighter outside the ring in professional boxing history. In other words, they gave him that championship belt. Did that mean he was a champion and was going to fight anymore? It was in significance to the fact that everybody believed he would have won that belt if he would not have gone to prison. Well, in March of 2012, Carter was diagnosed with prostate cancer. He was given 3 to 6 months to live. Shortly after the diagnosis, John Artis came and lived with Carter, caring for him until his death on April 20th, 2014. What happened to Lesra Martin, the kid that was virtually illiterate when he was picked out of the ghettos of Brooklyn, New York by the 3 hippie Canadians. He graduated from high school and the University of Toronto, and he eventually completed his master's degree and is now serving as a lawyer in British Columbia, specializing in personal injury. Here's a kid that couldn't even read or write when they picked him up. Okay, now, the significance of this is, how do you ever repay a guy, or 2 guys in this case, that spent 22 years in prison wrongfully accused? You guys aren't even 22 years old yet. It'd be like you being in prison the first 22 years of your life. How would you ever pay somebody back for that? It's an unbelievable crime. Now, this is why people have a little bit of fear of the death penalty. Because if they have the death penalty and they sentence these 2 guys to death, we've made a huge mistake, have we not? And so we won't get into that debate, because I personally believe there are times that you should use the death penalty, you know, but whatever. Now this is kind of cool. This is one of my prized possessions. This is the poster that was used to promote the movie The Hurricane. Denzel Washington played Rubin Hurricane Carter, and this is signed by both Rubin Hurricane Carter and John Artis. Very, very rare. Now, I would suggest to you that if you ever get a chance and you're bored on a weekend and you always say I don't have anything to do, get on Netflix or whatever TV thing you got in your house and watch this movie. It's a very, very good. It's fairly lengthy. It does have a tremendous amount of F-bombs in it, so prepare yourself, unless you could find the television version sometime. But it is really a very good movie to show the story I've explained to you in 10 minutes. That really is, it's a heartwarming story, but yet incredibly sad on how this poor guy really had troubles. He would not confine to prison rules. You can read that in the article I gave you. I expect you to read that for the quiz tomorrow, and just see what his philosophy was on this. He was a very patient man, but yet so wrongly accused and spent a tremendous amount of his life in prison. So that is the Rubin Hurricane Carter story in a quick snap. I encourage you to watch the movie, and we'll move on from there. Okay? Now, we're going to move on to the Apollo space program. Okay? Now, we talked about Mercury, right? We talked about Gemini, and we said that the whole purpose behind Gemini, Jacob Schaefer, was to do what? What was the whole purpose behind the Gemini space program? You just tell me, do you remember? To prepare for what? Moon landing. And it's going to be the Apollo space program that takes the bull by the horn, so to speak, that carries people to the moon. So the Apollo space program. Now, the Apollo space program actually began in 1961. 1961. And it ended in 1975. So the Apollo space program went from 1961 to 1975. Anybody know, just out of curiosity, when we landed on the moon? What year? 1969. Very good. And so it went past that as well. But it did begin in 61 and ended in 75. Each of the Apollo missions carried 3 astronauts. Each of the Apollo missions carried 3. And obviously we won't talk about them all. Now, I think I kind of mentioned this to you when we went through this before. During any moon landing missions, and the first one was Apollo 11, 2 of the astronauts would actually land and step foot on the moon, and the 3rd astronaut would stay with the orbiting capsule, okay? And we'll kind of explain this to you. So when you have a moon mission and 3 astronauts, only 2 of the 3 are going to set foot on the moon. The other one's going to drive the car, so to speak, okay? Now, during the Apollo program, which lasted from 1961 to 1975, they landed a total of 12 astronauts on the moon during that 14-year period. 12 astronauts landed on the moon. And I bet you can tell me the name of one off the top of your head, if that, right? Neil Armstrong. Buzz Aldrin also. But those were the first ones. Nobody really knows about all the others, or maybe I shouldn't say he doesn't care, but it's just less significant. The first one was the big one, okay? Well, if you look at an Apollo rocket, now look at that handout. I gave you a handout today that shows you the Apollo rocket and then shows it broken down. That would be very easy for us to figure out how this looks so you're clear. And I kind of explained it to you the other day, but it was with the models, but it was a little bit, probably maybe a little confusing. Okay, this right here, this whole thing here, is called Saturn V. This is the Saturn V rocket, the whole thing. And I had a little tiny model over there I showed you, but the whole thing is called Saturn V. And it really consists of 3 parts that you can see, and maybe you can write on your handout if you want to rather than your notes, I don't know. But this Saturn V rocket has 3 parts, or modules. Okay, M-O-D-U-L-E-S. Modules, M-O-D-U-L-E-S. So 3 parts, or they're better known as modules. They have the command module. They have the service module. And they have the lunar module. So the Saturn V rocket was a craft that carried 3 parts or 3 modules. The command module, the service module, and the lunar module. And we're going to tell you a little bit about each one so you kind of understand what they look like on this Apollo program, because they're all the same. So we'll start with the command module. Okay, command module. Now, you can see it on the front of your paper here. This area where you have the astronauts seated is the command module. It was a small 3-seat capsule. It was basically the living quarters and the control center for the astronauts. It was the living center and the control center for the astronauts. And it would be the command module that will return the astronauts to the Earth's surface. The whole Saturn V rocket's going to take off, right? But the only thing coming back to the Earth after the moon mission will be this command module. That's all, just the very tip of that. Okay, does everybody understand what the command module is? Okay, the service module was directly behind the capsule, directly behind the command module. And you can see it on your paper there, and it contained the engines. It contained thrusters to control the craft's flight. You remember what thrusters were? What they call that? They were making what when they were moving? Burns. And the burns come out of the thrusters. And if you look at the top of this sheet here where it says 20 right here, that's a thruster. And you see it goes in several different directions. So if they want to go this way, they hit this thruster. If they want to go this way, they hit this thruster. And they do what's called a burn. Okay? So it carried the engines along with the thrusters to control the craft's flight. The service module, which was the big problem in Apollo 13, if you ever got a chance to watch that movie, the service module also provided electricity, oxygen, and water to the command module. So your electricity, your oxygen that the astronauts need to survive, and the water they need to survive are all contained in the service module. Anybody watch Apollo 13? What was the problem with Apollo 13? What shorted out? Anybody know? They flipped the switch to stir the oxygen tanks, and it shorted, and they began to lose oxygen. And that was a major issue, which made them turn around and come back before they went to the moon.
What was the alien?
What?
Apollo 18.
Oh, that was.
Oh, wait, no.
Yeah, that was.
Let's talk about reality. Anyway, also the service module carried the communications equipment and fuel. Okay? Communications equipment and fuel. So your service module sat directly behind the capsule. It carried engines along with the thrusters to control the craft's flight. It also provided the electricity, oxygen, and water to the command module, and it carried the communications equipment and fuel as well. Pretty important part of the ship, okay? Then the lunar module. If you look on your map here, do you see this thing that's kind of folded up right in this area right here? Right in the ship? That's a lunar module, okay? And what the lunar module was to do, it was built to take 2 astronauts from the command module down to the lunar surface and then back up to the command module for the trip home. Now it looked kind of like a caterpillar in a way. I mean, it was a thing you got in, a box you got into with legs. And you'll see one in the National Air and Space Museum when we're in Washington, D.C. So the lunar module was built to take 2 astronauts down to the lunar surface and bring them back to the command module for liftoff. Now, the first one didn't, but 3 of the Apollo missions carried an LRV, a lunar roving vehicle. And basically, what was it? four-wheeler for the moon in a way. Okay, a little more sophisticated. But not the Apollo 11 mission that landed on the moon did not have one. But 3 of the Apollo missions did carry what was called an LRV, or Lunar Roving Vehicle. It was a four-wheeled moon buggy, basically, that enabled astronauts to explore more of the moon's surface than just where they could walk. So the LRV was involved in the Apollo program, but not in Apollo 11. Okay? So, our first mission in Apollo was Apollo 1. And unfortunately, you're going to see a little subtopic. It says the tragedy of Apollo 1. And that's what we're going to talk about. So the first Apollo flight was Apollo 1. And the entire Apollo program suffered a huge disaster on the first flight on January 27, 1967. January 27th, 1967, the Apollo program started out with a horrible disaster. January 27th, 1967. The astronauts that were assigned to Apollo 1 were Roger Chaffee and Edward H. White II. We talked about either before? No? Because that's why they're on the ID sheet, right? So Roger Chaffee and Edward H. White II were 2 of the 3 astronauts. The other one should be a more familiar name. It was Virgil Gus Grissom, who was part of the what flights? Mercury. Okay? So the 3 astronauts assigned to Apollo 1 were Roger Chaffee, Virgil Gus Grissom, and Edward H. White II. What happened is on January 27, 1967, the 3 were killed in a flash